What if a single open source internet project had the power to completely reshape the entire global economy forever? Let's mine deep. Bitcoin started as a hobby project. Nobody was paid to build it. Still, out of pure passion and curiosity, came a technology that is irreversibly changing the course of history. And just like its organic origins, the changes it's making to the world are not the result of force of any kind. But if it doesn't use any force, how is it changing the world? It's simply opening the floodgates between people and the freedom to transact, and in doing so, allowing the world to structure itself as it naturally would. Turns out, these floodgates make a lot of money for the people with the power to open them. It's how central banks and governments make most of their money. They facilitate things, be it transactions, loans, bank accounts, you name it, and take a big cut in the middle. But now, Bitcoin is opening those floodgates for everyone. And the power to grant the freedom to transact isn't such a selling point when anyone with internet access has that power already. This means the gigantic organizations that derive their power from these limitations suddenly become a lot less powerful when those limitations are lifted. In this sense, Bitcoin is changing the world in both a top-down and bottom-up way. Top-down in that the monopolistic entities such as central banks are now faced with healthy competition for the first time in their lives, inevitably forcing them to accommodate the rising standards of their customers. And bottom-up in that everyone around the globe has now the ability to go about their economic lives without reliance on the permission of others, completely free from the threat of bank failures and manufactured financial restrictions. By giving almost every human on Earth the sovereignty to sustainably save and transact the value they produce, Bitcoin changes the game in ways that are not only hard to predict, but impossible to prevent. For example, where borders used to present an opportunity for the floodgate controllers to extort huge fees from expats sending money home to their families, Bitcoin allows cheap cross-border payments and remittances for everyone. Where inflation was an inescapable fact, Bitcoin allows people to earn and save without central banks stealing their value. Where 1.4 billion people once had no access to banking, Bitcoin allows everyone to be their own bank, ushering 1 billion new contributors past the floodgates and into the economy. It's already hard to comprehend the magnitude of that last change alone. So anyone who tells you they know exactly how the economy will look once Bitcoin reaches escape velocity is overconfident at best. So why should you care? Because despite it being a huge change that will have millions of second and third order effects that nobody can predict in their entirety, there are some things we know for sure. Any way in which the world changes from Bitcoin will be the result of removing force, not adding it. And when you remove force from any system, the resulting change reveals how the system's constituent parts truly want to act. And in the case of the economy, you are one of those parts. So which sounds better? A true economy powered by individuals' freedom of optionality, or an economy based on force, tension, and intervention? Bitcoin provides you with the former, but you have to help it help you. And to do that, you gotta start by owning some. Don't miss Mark Moss Backstage. Do you believe Bitcoin can play a pivotal role in creating a more equitable global economy?
That's a fun question to jump on. I think the reason why Bitcoin makes a more equitable, I don't like that word, but more equitable global economy is the sense that nobody is able to print themselves more Bitcoin, right? And so the problem with the money system that we have today is something known as the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect is basically whoever's closest to the money printer has an advantage. I get the money first, cheapest, so I buy the assets first. By the time you get the money, the assets are more expensive and you pay more for the money. And so in the traditional fiat system, we have that Cantillon effect. Bitcoin doesn't allow for that. So because of that, nobody can just print themselves more Bitcoin. In a Bitcoin world, anybody, it's sort of like a gold world, you actually have to give up real resources. There's a true cost of capital to acquire gold, and there's a true cost of capital to acquire Bitcoin. And so because of that, everybody has the same opportunity to go get Bitcoin.
Considering Bitcoin's decentralized nature, how might nations approach monetary policy and economic strategies differently in a world where Bitcoin becomes the dominant store of value?
seeing nations adopt Bitcoin is going to be interesting because right now most nations have a money printer. And if they have a money printer, they don't want to give up the money printer. So for them to move to a Bitcoin standard means they can no longer print money for themselves. And so who's going to really want to go do that? So typically what we're seeing is fiat currencies are dropping like flies left and right. Back to Argentina, some of the worst inflation in the world right now, they're talking about just dumping their currency and going back to the dollar. So that's what happens when these fiat currencies die. They have to go back to the dollar. Once they go back to the dollar, then they can no longer print their own currency. So they could say, well, shoot, why would I go to the dollar, which they're going to continue to print more for themselves and ship the inflation to me, or I could just move to a Bitcoin standard and I'm not affected by that. That's sort of like what El Salvador has done. So El Salvador is on the dollar standard, but they're also on a Bitcoin standard as well. So I think we'll start to see more of that. Already we've seen now 4 nations are now starting to mine Bitcoin.
And in terms of global trade and commerce, how could Bitcoin reshape or redefine cross-border transactions and economic partnerships between nations?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So when you look at what we've seen really through the Renaissance age, starting around the 1400s into the 1500s, the world went into the longest period of like growth and development that we had seen. We had this global trade flourished, and there's a couple reasons why that happened. One of which was that we had a gold coin called the florin, which was the longest lasting gold coin in history, 400 years without debasement. But that gold coin, it was trusted, it wasn't debased, and it became internationally recognized. And because we had that gold coin that was internationally recognized and trusted, it allowed global trade to flourish. And so now each nation could specialize in what they were good at, and we saw that happen. So whenever global trade flourishes, wealth happens and global poverty, people come out of global poverty. So we have these charts. I was looking at a couple that I'll use in my presentation to show how in the last 150 years, the global poverty level has been lifted super high, and that's because of the global trade that's happened. Now, globalization, global trade, took a big hit. It really took off. It had never exceeded about 10% until the early 1800s. We had enough technology to do that, but it took a big hit in World War I and World War II because the whole world was at war. So there wasn't a lot of global trade happening at that time. It took about 60 years to get back to even. But now here we are in a point where the whole world is at war. Literally 3 wars going on, Russia, Ukraine, now in the Middle East. We also still have the whole China-Taiwan thing going on. None of the nations trust each other. Even the BRICS nations, for example, the R, which is Russia, the second largest nation, Putin couldn't even go to the BRICS summit in South Africa, the other member nation, because he might be arrested. So there's no trust between any of them. And so global trade, globalization is going to suffer. Unless we can come up with, one, a recognized type of money that is neutral. Nobody wants to use each other's money. A lot of the world's trying to de-dollarize, and so it's important to have some sort of a currency that will be globally recognized and neutral. And I think the only way that the world moves forward, it's inevitable, it's just going to be Bitcoin.